Good morning, and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net, and thanks for tuning in. I'm going to continue now our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power, but before I do, I want to recap just a bit. And what we're talking about is the conquest of the Normans of England. We're talking about the history of England, and what we've talked about so far is that the gospel-bearing Britons who were evangelized by the Apostle Paul held to biblical teachings, and they had a natural, or rather a Bible-based resistance, a natural resistance to this idea of the divine right of kings. They knew that Christ was their king, and only he had the right to rule over his people. But the papacy claims divine right as the vicar or the replacement of Christ on earth to rule all kings and all peoples, and to rule the world without question. So the Bible believers naturally repulsed at the idea that the Pope was the God of this world and that he had the right to govern the world through the kings of the earth. So they are natural-born enemies of the papacy. Now we have the Saxons. The Saxons, who historically were a people that chose their own kings, and they held their kings to account. In other words, a government that we would be friendly to, us Bible believers. So the Saxons, although their attitude toward the divine right of kings, which was just as opposed to it as were the Bible-believing Christians of England, were common enemies of the papacy. And these Anglo-Saxon people, or these Saxons, together with the Bible believers, provided a natural enemy of the papacy. Now, the Saxons had to be conquered by the papacy. And the papacy took measures to separate their kings from the people, saying that though they were kings, they were not kings under the permission of their people, but that they were kings by the divine providence of God. Okay? Kind of boosted their egos a little bit, didn't they? Didn't he? You're not kings by the consent of your people. You are kings by the consent of God himself. And I, the Pope, am his vicar and his mouthpiece on the earth. Therefore, you rule at my pleasure. Well, the Saxon kings, not willing to give up their right to govern the people, made their allegiance with the papacy. But the people of the Saxons held to their old beliefs that they only had the right to choose their own kings, and they had the right to hold their kings to account. So that there was a natural division between the Saxon people and their Saxon kings, who dominated England for a time. Now, during all the machinations of the papacy, the Angles, or the ancient Bible-bearing Britons, found harmony among the Saxon people, and they melded into their own society, kind of an amalgamation, a mutual respect for one another. They became the Anglo-Saxon people. And because of that melding together, that harmony that was derived over centuries of intermingling and intermarrying, the popes now saw these Anglo-Saxons as a common enemy, which they were. So the papacy had to shake things up in England again, and he used the Norman conquest of William the Conqueror to to assert the papal throne, the papal authority once again in England. Now, we're going to back up to the paragraph that we began on the broadcast yesterday, which we ended with yesterday. Speaking of this Norman conquest and the hidden purpose of the Vatican in all of it, it says the Norman conquest under William the Conqueror carried into England a fresh supply of papal influences. Remember, the papacy has to subjugate these Anglo-Saxons. Excuse me. Let me get this here. Now, at the death of Edward the Confessor, Harold became king by the almost unanimous consent of the nation. So the whole nation, the Anglo-Saxons in particular, approved of Harold becoming the king. He was elected by the Witan with the full approbation of the people, quote, in the exercise of their ancient and undoubted right, that is, to pick their own kings, and was, quote, acknowledged as king by every earldom and every shire in England. He was king alike by the will of his predecessor, by the choice of his people, by the consecration of the church, by the homage of the thanes and prelates of England, unquote. But William, Duke of Normandy, set up a claim to the throne based upon pretexts which, if they had been valid, would have conferred upon him no right whatsoever under the laws of England. He pretended that Edward had made to him a gift of the English crown before the selection of Harold as his successor, and that Harold had violated his oath to marry his daughter and to pay homage to him. William was a devout son of the Roman Catholic Church and submitted willingly to the direction of the great Lanfranc, Prior of Bec, and the foremost man of the Roman Catholic Church of Normandy. Whether the plan was concocted by both of them or originated in the fertile brain of the latter is of no consequence, but it was agreed that William should submit his claim to the decision of the Pope. That is, that the Pope alone should decide who should be King of England without any regard to the wishes of the people or the authorities of the nation. The Pope at that time was Alexander II, but the power behind the throne was the great Hildebrand, who later became Gregory VII, who we've talked about already. While any other foreign power on earth would have refused to decide such a question, yet the papal court did not hesitate to take jurisdiction of it, on the ground of possessing the divine right to dispose of kings and kingdoms. It was of no consequence to inquire what the English people desired. They were incompetent to decide what the law of God required or forbade. You see the arrogance of the papacy? The people don't count. They are not to govern or pick their kings. That's the sole prerogative of Christ, which is the sole prerogative of the Pope. You see how this works? The people are inconsequential. They have no right to pick their governors. Now, of the law, the Pope was the exclusive earthly custodian, as Pope Pius IX still claims to be, and his jurisdiction was derived directly from God. It marked a, quote, distinct epoch in the history of European politics, when for the first time the occupant of the apostolic throne was called on to adjudge a disputed diadem, unquote. The Emperor of William, an ecclesiastic, was sent to Rome to plead his cause. No notice of the proceeding was given to Harold, but the trial went on. The Pope was told that William, quote, craved the blessing of the Holy See upon his righteous cause, unquote, and if he succeeded, would, quote, hold of God and of the Apostle Peter the kingdom which he had hoped to win, unquote. On one side only it says only one side only was heard. In other words, Harold wasn't even a party to this negotiation between William and the Pope. Harold had no advocate there to defend himself against his Norman assailant. England had not submitted the disposal of her crown to such a tribunal and recognized no right but her own to give or take it away. But the interest of England was not the question to be discussed or decided. The only question considered by that papal tribunal was, what did the interest of the papacy require to be done? The ambitious Hildebrand saw that the occasion was one for the establishment of a precedent, which would enable the papacy thereafter to dispose of all other crowns, and his counsel triumphed. A decree was passed declaring Harold to be a usurper, and William of Normandy to be the lawful claimant to the English crown. Harold and his followers were excommunicated, and William was authorized to go forth as, quote, an avenger of heaven, unquote. He was required to teach the English people due obedience to Christ's vicar, that is, the Pope, and what the papacy never forgets, to secure a more punctual payment of the temporal dues of his apostle, unquote. In other words, the king was to go back to England, preach to the people that they were to submit to the Pope, and also to pay Peter pence. It continues, it says, a costly ring, a hair of the prince of the apostles, and a consecrated banner were sent to William in order that it might appear that his fraud and usurpation had the sanction of heaven. Every blessing held in store by the church was conferred upon William, and the terrible thunders of papal anathema were hurled at the head of Harold. While it is apparent that Pope Alexander II had in all this the double motive of subjugating England to the papacy and of giving greater strength and universality to its power, yet there is something behind it which the sagacious mind of Hildebrand could not have failed to discover. Although previous popes had employed the Saxon kings for the advancement of their ambitious designs, it was easy to see that it would not be safe to rely too much upon the Saxon and the British people, who now, by several hundred years of intercourse, had become molded into one. The Teutonic stock never furnished good materials for slavery, and therefore the papal policy was so directed as to place England in the hands of those more closely allied to the Latin race. Hence the preference given to and the pontifical blessing bestowed upon William of Normandy, a part of France. And hence also we find that after the Battle of Hastings, and before William had reached London, the Romish clergy went out to meet and congratulate him because he marched under the consecrated banner. In other words, the papal flag was accommodated by the papal blessing and was well disposed to the Roman Catholic Church. But little more was necessary to make the conquest of England complete. It was soon done, and William placed the crown upon his brow in the name not of the people of England, who were not even consulted, but of the Holy See of Rome. He had enforced with arms the decision of the Pope, and had brought England down in degradation to the feet of the papacy. Although William and other kings of the Norman line had some fierce controversies with the popes about investitures and other kindred questions, yet they constantly and actively endeavored to eradicate all the Saxon influences in England as far as possible, and substitute for them those of Norman origin, that is, to bring the country under the influence of the principles prevailing among the people of the Latin race, in preference to those of the Teutonic origin. The popes, in order that the victory in these controversies might be won, and at the same time to keep the kings within their grasp, conducted them on the part of the papacy with marked sagacity. They made a merit of necessity whenever it forced them to submit to firm and resolute princes, in order that thereby they might preserve their strength from the more complete control of the weaker ones. And when they succeeded at last in having their legates recognized in England, they were enabled to place by the side of the king a power sufficiently great to keep the nation bound fast to Rome and to war, by the aid of the Normans, more successfully against all the liberalizing influences of the Anglo-Saxons. You see how the papacy used the Normans to conquer the Anglo-Saxons, that melding together of societies that would reject any notion of the divine right of kings? Now, the popes, however, needed a more efficient instrumentality than any they had yet possessed to bring about the complete subjugation of the English people. This was the introduction of celibacy among the English clergy, and you might naturally raise your eyebrows and say, how in the world would celibacy aid the Pope in getting control of the English people? Listen carefully. This is the real reason behind celibacy, and I want my listeners to understand it. It was considered absolutely necessary to the perfect working of the papal system that there should be organized a compact body of ecclesiastics, in other words, priests, destitute of all those generous sympathies which grow alone out of the family relation, that they might be the better fitted to do the work of the popes. Okay? So if you want a loyal soldier at your service, the best thing to do is pick an unmarried man, one who is not committed first and foremost to his wife and his children. Okay? Celibacy, for those who don't know, literally means forbidding to marry. It's a doctrine of demons, so says God in the Scriptures. It's a mark of Antichrist. And this was prerequisite. It became prerequisite in the English priesthood that they be celibate, that they not be married. And this better fitted them to divorce them from any natural affection to anything but the papacy. If you want to think of it this way, the Pope became their spouse. And all the efforts and loyalties that would have been given to wife and children and family left a void in their lives that was replaced by the papacy. And that made them the most fit people to work for the papal cause, that is, to extend the papal temporal power over the world. And it had a side benefit as well. These celibate priests wouldn't be tempted to pilfer the incalculable wealth of the Roman Catholic Church and pilfer it off to their wives and children as bequests. So Rome was not only empowering itself through an army of celibate priests who had no other affection in the world than the popes and the church, and at the same time they protected the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church. You see where Rome's heart lies? Now, notwithstanding sacerdotal celibacy finds no sanction among the early Christian fathers and is directly opposed to the example of Peter and a majority of the apostles, yet its introduction as a matter of policy was a display of great sagacity. The experience of mankind has demonstrated that there's no other place around which so many of the most ennobling sentiments continually cluster as the domestic hearthstone, and that those who cherish in their hearts the kindly affections of home and kindred are the last to yield to such dictates of inhumanity as have been often exhibited by those who have built up and maintained the papacy. Therefore, the celibacy of the Roman Catholic clergy has been, since its introduction, considered one of the most effective means of establishing the supremacy of the popes. And for this purpose, the attempt was made to introduce it into England after the Norman conquest. The Pope then desired, as the present Pope also does, and he's speaking of Pope Pius IX, who was reigning at the time of the writing of this book, to set apart the clergy from the body of the community as a privileged class with power to govern themselves by laws of his and their own enacting, independently of the civil power and the laws of the state. The English clergy were at first unwilling to give up their wives. Pope Gregory VII, the great Hildebrand that we've talked about so much, during the reign of William the Conqueror, had a decree passed by a council at Rome forbidding them to marry. The clergy resisted it, for many of them had wives. A synod was called to consider the question, but it did not adopt the decree. A compromise was agreed upon with the Pope's legate to the effect that those who had cures in the cities should put away their wives, while those who had benefices in the country should be allowed to retain them, but that none should be thereafter admitted to orders, in other words, the priesthood, before they had sworn that they would not marry, thus showing that celibacy is a mere measure of expediency and involves absolutely no religious principle. The imposition of this restraint had the effect of preventing competent men from taking orders and inflicted serious injury upon the character of the papacy. Pope Paschal II, to remedy this, showing at the same time how pliant the principles of the papacy are when an important result is to be obtained, decided not to execute the canon rigorously in England and granted a dispensation power to the Archbishop of Canterbury. But this prelate was less accommodating than the Pope and procured the condemnation of marriage by the decree of a London synod. No, she called his own synod. And he became more opposed to the marriages of the priest than even the Pope was. Now, Pope Honorius II had to send one of his cardinals to England to see that it was executed. When he reached there, he, as legate, convened a council wherein he denounced the married clergy in violent terms, saying, among other things, that, quote, now listen to this, "'Twas a horrible crime to rise from the side of a harlot and then to handle the consecrated body of Christ," unquote. He simply referred to their wives as harlots, and that it was unseemly for them to have been with their wives in bed the night before and then rise up early in the morning to handle the Eucharist. And that's how they shamed these priests into giving up their wives. What a twisted sense of morality, that a lawfully married man should regard his wife a harlot and then make him unfit to touch the Eucharist the next morning at Mass. We'll continue right after these messages on Inquisition Update. Stay tuned.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Okay, back to Inquisition Update. We're talking about the Norman conquest of England and what it bodes for the papacy. It gave the papacy new strength. And taking advantage of that new power in England under the Norman rule, the papacy imposed priestly celibacy. Now, the Pope, knowing that that's going to be a hard row to hoe, sent a legate with the ability to give dispensation. But he instead called a council and was even more firm than was the Pope in imposing this celibate requirement of the priesthood. And in order to shame them, simply said, "'Twas a horrible crime to rise from the side of a harlot and then to handle the consecrated body of Christ," unquote. Now, for those who don't know, this consecrated body of Christ is a reference to the Eucharist, that piece of bread that under the mystical and superstitious power of the priest who believes he can transform that bread into the literal blood, body, soul, and divinity of Christ. That is, the whole Christ, nothing lacking. That piece of bread becomes Jesus Christ himself. In other words, the priest becomes the creator of the creator, and then offers Jesus again thousands of times over every day on the altar of the Mass, on the altar of the Roman Catholic Church as a continual sacrifice, making the assumption that his one-time sacrifice on the cross at Calvary was insufficient, and that it should be repeated thousands of times every day all over the world by as many priests. That they shouldn't touch the body of Jesus, this holy piece of bread, after sleeping with their wives the night before, soiling their hands as if they were lying with a prostitute, a harlot. You see how twisted the Roman Catholic Church is? These people were lawfully married under God's law. There was no shame in being married. The apostles were married. But this isn't a Christian system. This is an Antichrist system. And its only purpose, which has absolutely nothing whatever to do with religion or Christianity specifically, is the doctrine of demons. Forewarned in the Bible, forbidding to marry is a doctrine of demons. It is the Church of Antichrist, and this is one of its defining and characteristic marks. Priestly celibacy. It was done for no religious purpose whatsoever, certainly no biblical purpose. It's completely antithesis to all the teaching in the Bible. But it was to advance the papal power and to elevate the priesthood to an elite class of people for simply worldly gain for the Pope. Now, continuing what it says here, that night, after this impious and vulgar assault upon one of the tenderest and most endearing relations of life, marriage, a relation sanctioned by the example of the Apostle Peter himself, this pure-minded cardinal, fresh from Rome and at the side of the infallible Honorius II, was caught in bed with a common woman. This, too, is characteristic of this hypocritical church, that the very night when this prelate forbid the priest to marry, was caught in bed with a common woman. Now, you might imagine all of his words fell to the ground once this became public knowledge. They caught the cardinal in bed with a common woman. What a hypocrite! You tell us we ought not to be married, that we ought not to sleep with our wives, and then in the next morning handle the blessed Christ, and then you turn around and sleep with a woman? You yourself a priest and a prelate of the Roman Catholic Church? What hypocrisy! Now, of course, his precepts had but little effect against an example such as this, and other efforts were rendered necessary. So that attempt fell to the ground. Rome just simply embarrassed itself with this hypocrisy. So, in order to enforce celibacy upon the priesthood, they had to go to Plan B. Plan A failed miserably. And it says, some years after, another council was held when it was considered necessary to give the power of enforcing the canon law to the king, a duty which he readily undertook. Like the popes, in the use of their dispensing power, he employed his authority to raise his royal revenue, quote, by selling to the priests a dispensation to keep their wives, unquote. So now, this proving again that this is not motivated by religious belief at all. This is simply a way to protect the assets of the church and to increase the power of the Pope And since their first plan A fell to the ground in hypocritical embarrassment, they were simply going to make some money out of the deal. Okay, so they sold dispensations so the priests could keep their wives. So if you want to keep your wife, we'll allow you to keep your wife, but on one condition. You got to pay us. In other words, you have to pay an indulgence. You see what this is? It's an indulgence, a license. They were actually paying for a license to do that which is lawful in every sense of moral decency. Turning God's law upside down, turning the institution of marriage upside down, and making it a source of revenue for the Roman Catholic Church. Now, but notwithstanding all these difficulties, celibacy finally became the absolute law of the Church of England, as elsewhere. The papal Caesar needed his corps of ecclesiastical subordinates as completely devoted to him as were the commanders of the Roman legions to the pagan Caesars. Each struggled for absolute dominion, and the example of one was followed by the other. Rome, with each, was the central seat of the empire, the mistress of the world. Having by these means and the politic use of the benefices and honors of the church, caused the clergy to center all their affections upon the papacy. The popes were enabled to persevere in their schemes to aggrandize their power to such an extent that they compelled the disgraceful and humiliating surrender of the crown to them by King John. Pope Innocent III resolved that the Archbishopric of Canterbury should be filled by Cardinal Langton, who, though an Englishman, had received a foreign education in France, that is, Catholic France, without regard to the wishes or the consent of the king. John firmly resisted this for a while, and the Pope, to punish him, placed the kingdom under interdict, so that divine services, that is, the services of the church, ceased in all the churches. The sacraments were withheld. Now remember, the Roman Catholic faith is a sacramental faith. In other words, you have to perform these rituals and these itemized lists of sacraments in order that grace may be infused. So if you can't participate in the sacraments, if the church doors are closed, you can't have grace infused. You are yet in your sins. Do you comprehend this? John firmly resisted this for a while, and the Pope, to punish him, placed the kingdom under interdict, so that divine service ceased in all the churches, the sacraments were withheld, public prayers were forbidden, and the churchyards were closed, the dead being thrown into ditches like dogs without any funeral ceremony. So this is what happens when the Pope shuts down the church, shuts the doors to the quote-unquote kingdom of heaven, right? The Roman Catholic religion. It simply shuts the doors of the church. Do you think Christ would have ever shut the doors to his church? Another mark of Antichrist. The papacy just simply issues an interdict, shuts down all the activities of the Roman Catholic Church, deprives the people of their Savior, that piece of bread called the Eucharist. Nobody can get married. Nobody can have their babies baptized, which means if they die before they're baptized, according to the cult of Rome, they go to hell, or rather purgatory, or limbo. And no one can be buried because the priest presides over the funeral. And if the church is shut down and Uncle Harry dies, you have no choice but to just toss his body in the ditch. Now, the king, in retaliation, treated the clergy with severity. Why? Why did the king treat the priests with severity? Because they obeyed the Pope. Okay? It's not a Christian religion at all. And it exposes its unchristian character whenever these interdicts are imposed by the popes. The king, in retaliation, treated the clergy with severity and was at last excommunicated by the pope. John remained unmoved until the controversy became one involving simply, on one side, the triumph of the king, on the other, that of the pope, neither party having the slightest regard for the interests or welfare of the people, and both king and pope entirely subordinating the peace and quiet of the church to their own personal ambitions for supremacy. The pope finally sent 2 nuncios to England, with whom John was persuaded to agree that some ecclesiastics he had banished should be permitted to return, that the privileges of the church should be restored, and that Langton should be confirmed as Archbishop of Canterbury, thus yielding to the Pope everything that he had desired at the beginning of the quarrel. But he yielded too readily, and displayed so little real courage, that Innocent III was too bold a politician not to take immediate advantage of it. His manifest object was to humiliate the king, and reduce the kingdom to entire submission to himself, so that he could bring all the people under ecclesiastical government, with Rome as the seat of all authority. Therefore he demanded that all that had been taken from the clergy should be restored and full damages paid, when he knew that it was impossible for the king to do either. John being compelled to refuse, the Pope pronounced another sentence of excommunication against him and took immediate steps to stir up a revolt against the government by endeavoring to increase the dissatisfaction already existing among the people. And you might imagine the people were suffering. They were Roman Catholics. Their salvation depended upon the church, and the Pope's interdict closed the church. In other words, salvation was deprived of them. And they were getting mighty sick and tired of seeing them being the sufferers in the midst of this quarrel between the Pope and the king. Now, the occasion was one which displayed the towering ambition of Pope Innocent III and developed in a most striking degree the character of the papal policy, which under like circumstances would be developed in the same way today or tomorrow. R.W. Thompson's plainly telling us nothing has changed. If the same circumstances existed today, the current Pope would act the same way. Now, pretending that the refusal of the king to do what he knew he had no power to do was rebellion against his authority as God's vicegerent, he fulminated a terrible bull, absolving the English people from their allegiance to the crown and commanding them upon pain of excommunication no longer to obey their king. I want to ask my listeners, what do you think would happen in this country if the Pope issued a decree like this to the Catholics in this country, which now includes all of Christianity after Vatican Council II and the ecumenical movement? You know, prior to that, Catholics, card-carrying Catholics represented about 25% of the population. Now it's well over 50% that the Roman Catholic hierarchical lobbyists in Washington now represent. They can walk into our government and say, now, we don't represent just card-carrying Catholics. We have successfully united all of Christianity, Catholic, Protestant, Evangelical, Baptist, the whole lot. And when we lay down our card in Washington, D.C., we're laying down over 50% of the population of this country, and we demand your obedience to our demands. And if Washington refuses, the Pope can simply do what he's done throughout all of history: command the majority of the people of the United States to rebel against the government, not to obey its laws, and by force to overthrow that government. You suppose that might be in the offing for the United States now that the Roman Catholic hierarchical prelates in Washington, D.C. now claim to represent well over 50%. I'm just using that term. It might even be closer to 75% of the population of this country would call themselves Christian. That's a mandate. That's not a majority. That's a mandate. And you better believe there's no one more qualified in the world to drive a mandate than the priests of Rome, who have no other desire than to make Roman Catholicism the state-sponsored religion of this country. Call it Christian if they will, but it'll be Roman Catholic. And if necessary, to overthrow the government and our Constitution in the process. And I believe that was the very heart of, as does R.W. Thompson believes, that was the very essence of the encyclical and syllabus of error by Pope Pius IX in 1864, 150 years ago. Are we to assume that 150 years ago has been forgotten, and that somehow the popes have changed their mind when they haven't changed their mind at any time in history in regards to the extension of the papal power? This is the warning of R.W. Thompson. How this temporal monster has grown throughout history, and to show us through history what the papal power has become in the world over the kings of the earth and over the people, even to the point of being able to shut down the churches and deprive the people of their religious fix every Sunday. Now, an event so remote as this would seem at first glance to have no special relation to the present times. But when it is observed that Innocent acted under a claim of divine right and of infallibility, and that the present Pope, Pope Pius IX, sets up precisely the same claim, it is the highest importance that the principle upon which he bases his supposed right to release the English people from their allegiance to their own government should be well understood. What Pope Innocent III then did in England, Pope Pius IX undoubtedly thinks he has the power and the right to do in all the governments now existing in the world. For that purpose, the late Lateran Council enacted the decree of papal infallibility. In ascertaining this principle of papal usurpations, we are not confined to Protestant authority. It is distinctly avowed by one of the most distinguished Roman Catholic authors, one whose history of England is recommended to the faithful in the United States. Lingard referred to the relations between Innocent III and King John, states the ground upon which the former acted as avowed by himself in interfering with the dispute between John and the King of France, a matter purely temporal. He says that in this explicit statement is set forth, quote, more plainly than any speculations of modern writers, the real ground upon which the popes assumed their pretended authority in temporal matters, unquote, and therefore the language of the Pope is more worthy of careful scrutiny. He gives the following as the reasons by which Innocent justified himself. Listen to this reasoning. Quote, he first transcribes the following message from the Gospel. Quote, if thy brother trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between him and thee alone. And if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as a heathen man and a publican. This is a quote from Matthew chapter 18, verse 15 through 17. Now, he, Pope Innocent, proceeds, quote, the King of England maintains that the King of France, by enforcing the execution of an unjust sentence, has trespassed against him. He has therefore admonished him of his fault in a manner prescribed by the gospel, and meeting with no redress, has, according to the direction of the same gospel, appealed to the church. How then can we, whom divine providence has placed at the head of the church, refuse to obey the divine command? How can we hesitate to proceed according to the form pointed out by Christ himself? We do not arrogate to ourselves the right of judgment as to the fee. That belongs to the King of France. But we have a right to judge respecting the sin, and that right it is our duty to exercise against the offender, be he who he may. By the imperial law, it has been provided that if one of two litigant parties prefer the judgment of the apostolic see to that of the civil magistrate, the other shall be bound to submit to such judgment. But if we mention this, it is not that we found our jurisdiction on any civil authority. God has made it our duty to reprehend the man who falls into mortal sin, and if he neglect our reprehension, to compel him to amend by ecclesiastical censures. Moreover, both kings have sworn to observe the late treaty of peace, and yet Philip has broken that treaty. The cognizance of perjury is universally allowed to belong to the ecclesiastical courts. On this account, there we have also the right to call the parties before our tribunal." Unquote. You see how they twist the gospel to justify their pretended Antichrist power, and to judge between kings, and to judge all manner of sin, and even to absolve one of sin and not of another, based on their own temporal and spiritual whim? Is this the kind of justice we would expect a man who calls himself the vicar and the replacement of the Son of God on earth? This, by no stretch of any imagination, could be called a Christian church. This is not Christianity. The Pope is not the replacement of Christ on earth. He is Antichrist. And this perversion of the gospel to justify the temporal power of the Antichrist is characteristic of the Antichrist church. Thanks for listening today. We'll continue with our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power, on Inquisition Update tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, To get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.